Good evening and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. My name is Rory, and if you've never been here before, you're looking at Varietal Literature's YouTube page, and specifically, it's Tuesday night, so it's Fireside Fairytales. If you came over from our Thursday night streams called Varietal Show, that's where we do live writing. This is a different vibe. It's just me telling stories with a bit of sound effects. Good for background. Good if you like old folklore. Good if you're looking for story ideas and you're a writer, things like that. But beyond that, if you don't want to hear certain stories, or you want to jump ahead, or you don't want to listen to this chatter anymore, and you're not watching it live, check in the description below. There will be timestamps that'll jump you ahead to whatever section is most interesting to you. If you are here live, though, join me in the live chat. I do check on it sort of between stories and so on, and I'm always curious to see what people respond to in stories. Helps me decide in the future what to do. And of course, if you like the stream, do remember to like it. GS says good evening. Good evening, GS. Shayna Towers, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, says good evening. Good evening, Shayna. Thank you for coming by. This is a little loud. Let's turn that music down a bit. Tonight we're talking about The Devil's Bride, specifically in German folklore, but The Devil's Bride comes up in lots of different places because it's, I think it's just an easy concept. It's just something that you would inevitably stumble upon. Exactly why The Devil's Bride, or what it means, depends on the story, and we're going to see a few stories here tonight that sort of explore those different versions of things. So off the bat, though, because I do like to put a little frame on stories before I start to tell them. Again, all the stories we're going to read are German, so they're not cohesive. They're not a cover of all possible versions of this trope. However, this trope in German folklore seems to be about one of two things, sometimes both at once, sometimes very distinctly one or the other. The first thing it sometimes is about, though honestly this is not the most common, is the predatory nature of certain types of men, which was accurate then and accurate now. So men who will lie and cheat and then sweep you off for nefarious needs. Nothing romantic. Let's be clear about that. But more often, the Devil's Bride thing is moral tales about being unwomanly. Whether that's not obeying whoever's the male of the house, or whether that's not doing your work, as harsh as you could, that sort of Lutheran streak you see in folklore, or whether that's being loose with men. The Devil's Bride trope is kind of there to construct stories about the consequences of being so unwomanly, which is, by the way, I think fertile ground for rewriting a lot of these tales to be a little bit better or a little bit more satisfying, let's say, and less, well, let's face it, overtly sexist. So in other words, a lot of these are basically, I think you could probably guess, would be stories constructed by bitter, broken-hearted men, because very often it's like they broke a vow, or they didn't treat some guy right. Or I would argue it's like dads trying to terrify their teenage daughters into not being swept off their feet. He could be the literal devil. In any case, if you are a writer out there and you like these tales, I am very interested in an alternative tellings of them, where maybe the girls aren't so looked down upon and condescended to. But nonetheless, the stories are entertaining. And it is made very clear that some of them are straight up deserve what they get. Some of them are just, they didn't meet social expectations. So that's what you can expect tonight. We're going to go through 3 stories at least. The first one being very short, but the next 2 being fairly substantial. And once we get to the end of those 3 stories, I'm going to see what time it is, because there's a couple of more I can read that I have prepped, but I don't think we'll have time for. And they do kind of cover similar ideas, so it's not absolutely crucial. Shayna says that is the correct pronunciation of their name. Well, good. Yeah. Glad I got that right. Thanks for letting me know. Okay. All the stories tonight come from Jürgen Hubert, who, if you're a regular viewer of the channel, you will be well aware of. He is a translator, contemporary modern-day translator of a bunch of previously untranslated German collections of folklore. Not just the Grimm brothers, there's a whole bunch of others that did the same thing, but they didn't get translated as widely as the Grimm brothers. So, Jürgen is sort of freeing those stories into English at least. And in many cases that means when I tell these stories, it could be the first time pretty much any English speakers have heard them. Certainly they might have read them if they follow his Patreon, which you should, but this might be the first time you've ever heard any of these in English, which is an honor I don't take lightly. If you do want to read these for yourself, because I certainly am not reading all of them, and there are more to be found with Jürgen's commentary, you should go to his Patreon, which will be in a pinned comment when this video is no longer live, and support him for a few dollars, and he will have stories for you each month. Sorry, somehow it jumped way, way out of place. There we go, Devil's Bride. Oh. Okay. Come back to this story. It's enough talking from me. Our first stories will get underway. I'm going to turn the music down just a touch more. And I'm going to knock down the fireplace a touch more. And I'm going to give us a little bit of ambiance for the little town that we begin our story in, or I should say valley. Our first story tonight comes to us from Jürgen Hubert's collection of translated German folklore called Sunken Castles, Evil Poodles, which you can support in the Patreon link in the pinned comment below. And it is called The Maid and the Devil. And it is a short piece that introduces a lot of key concepts about the devil's wife trope. In a village near Nuremberg, there was a farm maid who loved a huntsman. And when the maid went to cut hay, that huntsman always came out of the forest to meet her, and he would walk with her to a dear, sweet, and private meadow. And when she was about to cut hay, he said, "Don't bother, my dear girl," and pulled her down into the grass, and laughed, and flirted, and snuggled with her. Snuggled. And when it was time to go home, the maid had nothing to do than to bundle the hay, for it had already been cut while they romped around in it. Now, the maiden had done so for an entire spring and summer when she once told her mistress in a merry mood, "I don't work, and yet the hay has always been cut." Well, the farmer's wife was wise. She shook her head, thought this was uncanny, and told the local priest about it. Well, the priest commanded that the maiden, that she should, as if in play, pull off the huntsman's left boot. She did so, obviously not really knowing what to expect, but was startled to behold a goat's foot on her beloved huntsman out in the hay. Her lover was, God be with us. Just a note here, God be with us is a thing that was said instead of Satan or the devil's name. So her lover was the devil. And when the priest heard of this, he gave her 2 herbs. If her life was dear to her, she must carry it above her heart. And the huntsman thus never appeared again while the maid was cutting hay. But around midnight, he was frequently seen sneaking around the maiden's home, where he wailed, "Frankincense and myrrh have taken my beautiful bride." All right. So we see there the bride or the maiden is being, maiden just kind of means unmarried woman here. The maiden was being sort of lustful in the grass and lazy about her chores, and therefore it must have been the devil who drew her in, and she by the merits of the church manages to avoid damnation. Now there are some key things here. This isn't true of every encounter story that we're going to read. In fact, we'll see one that doesn't have this, although I will make a note about it later. However, the overarching idea is that you have to have given in to temptation or taken some deal. You have control over the devil's involvement in your life, and then he has control over you. It is unusual for a person to simply be a victim to the devil despite making no such claim or having such power. Because, of course, the point of the devil is that you indulge in temptations, and that's what gives him power. So this next story is unique because it doesn't involve that key detail, which is a detail, and I won't read them because they are his, but it is a detail in Jürgen's commentary on this story that he makes a point about and has some theories as to why it's so different than the rest of the canon about devils. But you should go to his Patreon and read it, because it's good. I'm not going to do it here. Instead, I will read you the tale and you can come to your own conclusions. GS says they didn't want to utter the evil one's name in case they beckoned him. Indeed. You see that echoed in, well, in a story I shall not be named. Let's put it that way. Okay. This next one's about a little village. Well, it starts there anyways. Our next story is called the Käthelstein Rock near Annaberg. And it comes to us from Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles, translations by Jürgen Hubert. Now a long time ago, a foreman named Gunther lived in the village of Frohnau near Annaberg. Now, this foreman was a devout and honest man. Once, however, during the winter, he was walking back to his daily labors. From his daily labors, in a mine that was near his home. And as he walked back, he passed through the middle of the forest, and suddenly a man stepped out from the undergrowth and approached him. This man, he pleaded to be allowed to spend the night at the foreman's house. for he did not dare search for his own path any further in the deep snow and the dark night. While the foreman didn't care either for the voice or the appearance of the stranger, he still had pity for him and thus agreed to his wish. They therefore strode together towards the village in silence. When they reached the house of Gunsa, his daughter Katerina opened the door, and then she started to wail terribly. And when she beheld the strange guests, and she dropped the lamp she'd been carrying out of fright. And only after her distraught father had lit the lantern again and revived his daughter, who had fallen unconscious, did he notice that the stranger had vanished. He thus hurriedly asked his daughter why she'd been so frightened. But she answered that this man, the man that he had brought home who had vanished, had been the devil who wanted to carry her away as his bride. For she had dreamed the previous night that she was lying in the forest, and then a man approached her who looked just like the now vanished stranger. He had called her his bride, kissed her, and then he walked away and revealed himself as the devil by his horns, tail, and horse's feet. Old Gunsa then was about to console her when he saw a sheet of paper lying on the table, and on it was written, "In 9 weeks I knock at the window at midnight and take my bride away." Now there was no longer any doubt that the dream had come true. Father and daughter then spent 9 weeks in fear and worry. Well, they prayed from mornings to evenings and went on to the Eucharist. A little voice told them that the evil one would not be deterred so easily. And indeed, this was the case. For when the midnight hour of the last day of this deadline that his note had given passed, there was a knock on the window, and a terrible voice called out, "Bride outside! Bride outside!" But Gunsa loudly called upon God Almighty for aid, and the God be with us vanished under thunder and lightning. Leaving only with the words, "9 more days, and then you shall be my bride. Otherwise I will set your heart ablaze." Thus, 9 further days passed under fear and worry, and again that dreaded midnight hour approached, and with the 12th strike of the bell, there was a knock on the window, and a shout, "Out with the bride, or the house will burn!" But old Gunsa wrapped his arms around his insensible daughter and said, "By the wounds of Christ, be gone from us, Satanas!" And then the devil roared, "Bride, the house is ablaze, and you have 9 further weeks. And if you are not mine by this date, then your father shall come to a miserable end." And with these words, old Nick vanished. However, the house was indeed set ablaze, and only with the greatest efforts were they able to survive. So they first sought shelter with relatives, but soon compassionate people built them a new hut on the outskirts of the forest, for their former hut had been turned not just to ash, but a stinking sulfur pit. But their fears did not abate, for the devil's words were still ringing in their head. 9. Once again, that 9th week approached, and when Käthelstein was overcome by sleep during broad daylight. Now, just a word on translation here. Käthelstein is Katarina, the daughter. Chen is a suffix that is what we call a diminutive suffix. There's a version of it. There's not really a version of it in English, but there is in, for example, Japanese with ko. It basically makes it a cutesy slang way of saying Katarina. Käthelstein was overcome by sleep during broad daylight. She dreamed that the devil and his entourage peered into her window and wanted to abduct her into his hellish residence. And when she rose up from her sleep with a frightful scream, the door opened. And an angel appeared. This angel was illuminated by a rose-like light and floated into the house, carrying a crucifix high up in his hand. He waved to her and spoke, "Come to me, and I will bring you peace." He then led little Katarina through the forest on a path that was wholly unfamiliar to her. Until they finally reached a rock formation. The rock opened up when the angel touched it with his crucifix, and now they stepped through a gap into the rock until they reached a tall gate which shone like silver and white gold. 7 old men with pointed caps, long beards, were sitting in front of this gate. And the maidens stepped into a chamber with a high ceiling which was adorned by a multitude of gemstones, glimmering like the night sky. She received its light from their shine. In this chamber, though, a beautiful woman was lying on a splendid bed beneath this luxurious, gem-infused canopy. The woman was illuminated by a wreath of stars, and her feet were blessed by 7 dwarves who kneeled in prayer. When she beheld the angel, she asked what made him come here, but the angel told her of the dire threat to the unfortunate girl and asked the woman for her assistance. So then the queen of the mountains, for that's who it was that lay in the bed, commanded one of the dwarves to bring her an urn made of sardonyx. And I will read the footnote on this. It's a type of onyx where the colored bands are made out of sard and are thus reddish in color. From a crystal cupboard, she took a cross made out of sparkling diamonds out of it and spoke, Käthelstein, carry this cross on your chest at all times, and the evil one will not have any power over you. And upon hearing these words, the dwarf took a rope of pearls from an urn and tied the cross to it, and then hung it around Katarina's neck. Then he took Käthelstein once again by the hand and led her back on the same path on which they had arrived. And when he had opened the rock once more with the aid of that crucifix, he took his leave from her and told her that she should be troubled no longer, for now she was under God's protection. When Käthelstein arrived home, she encountered her father in the house and told him what had occurred. She also showed him the cross as proof of her tale. Then he replied something similar had occurred to him, for he had recovered a golden crucifix in that mining shaft near the ditch where he worked. When they examined it more closely, so that they could find some kind of attribute by which they could identify these luxurious crucifixes' proper owners, they saw the name of the foreman engraved in it with the words, "Jesus will help the faithful." And so in this manner they awaited the end of the week in good cheer, as well as the midnight hour that they had dreaded so much before. Finally midnight came, and the last strike of the clock was hardly over when there was a knocking on the window. And a roar.
"Out with the bride! Out with the bride!"
When Käthel opened the window herself, she showed the devil her shining cross, and he retreated with terrible wailing. Ah! But first he shouted,
"Käthelstein, you are protected by the power of God. I have no power over you. But now, it's your turn, Gunther. Follow me into hell. Come outside so that I can grab you."
But here, too, the old man had to retreat, for Gunther presented his golden crucifix, which he'd found in his mine. However, this time, the devil did not vanish as quietly as he had during previous encounters. Instead, a terrible thunderstorm broke out. And a gale uprooted the strongest trees and shook the hut in its foundations, and a small rivulet flowing out of the forest swelled to a raging stream and threatened to wash the hut away. But as soon as the clocks struck 1 o'clock, everything became quiet again, and the silver light of the moon shone brightly from between the clouds. In this manner, Käthelstein got rid of her infernal groom, and 2 years later she married that stout-hearted miner from Fronau, who had lost his heart to her quite some time ago. The mine manager gave this man the position of old Gunther, who now decided to retire and spend the rest of his life with his children. God gifted him with 10 further years of life, and he had the joy of holding 3 grandchildren in his arms. But when God called him home, his Käthelstein did not forget what fate she had shared with her, and how the Queen of the Mountain had given them splendid hospitality. Thus she had her father buried at the spot, at the rock, where the angel had opened it. And subsequently she went there every day in order to pray for the succor of the dear departed soul. She did this for long years, until she herself was old and gray, as her father had been. And it was one day that she did not return when she had gone out to pray on her father's grave. And when her husband and her children came out to search for her, they only found her corpse. But then the angel that had once before visited her, cloaked in that rose-like light, stepped out of the rock, kissed the departed woman on her forehead, and took off her diamond cross, then rose up to the heavens. And the grieving husband then called on some of his comrades and broke a space for a grave into the rock, and there was enough space to put the coffin into it. And the mourners were about to do just that. 2 more angels descended, and they lifted the coffin from the bier and put it into the rock and closed it again so artfully with a large block of stone that nobody could perceive where the opening had been. And since that time, the rock where Käthelstein sleeps, her eternal sleep is called Käthelstein, or Käthel's Rock. GS says 9, not a holy number like we usually hear about 3 or 7. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know why 9. I think I've heard, I don't know for sure, I think I've heard that 9 might have been associated with the devil, like 6 can be. Okay. Our next story we'll move right on to, because as you can see, they are a little longer today. So, well, I mentioned I would say something about it. I'm not going to give away all of Jürgen's notes, but he makes a good point there, which is what's different about that story is nobody seems to have done anything to invite the devils in. And it's not clear why they had to like specifically seek out God's protection, when usually in those scenarios it's just assumed that the devil cannot hurt you if you haven't done something to invite in, like given into temptation or taken a deal or whatever else. Jürgen sort of makes a case that it might not be a traditional story, but again, I'll let you read that for yourself when you go and support him on his Patreon. I should say, Jürgen's not like a close personal friend of mine or anything. This isn't some hustle. I met him through this, asking him if I could read the stories. So I just genuinely think you should support him. Okay. Now, this is my personal favorite story tonight. It's called The Legend of the Devil's Bath near Michaelstein, Abbey. I don't know exactly what it is I like about this, but there is something a little bit more ragged around the edges than Folklore normally is. And I don't mean crazy. It's actually pretty cohesive in its character and so on. This one, though, I think could use either an alternate ending or an alternate telling. It's not a Fireside Fairytales if I don't slightly kick my camera. GS says that folktale was epic. Could be quite the movie. No kidding, yeah. Has to be something to do with the father showing hospitality to the devil in the snow, but usually they don't discourage that, right? He shows pity, which is like the fundamental Catholic principle, right? Like you see that in Lord of the Rings as well, because the writer was a Catholic. About, pity is what stayed his hand, Frodo. And his famous line, I'm gonna mess up. It was pity that stayed his hand, Frodo. Many have it's something to the effect of many have the power to take life, but do you have the power to give it, or something to that effect? And you're quick to, I don't know, somebody else remind me. It is a quote I like, but I have terrible memory for this sort of thing. Okay. Let's get a little bit more rain. The next story is called The Legend of the Devil's Bath near Michaelstein, Abbey. And it comes to us from Jürgen Hubert's Sunken Castles, Evil Poodles, which you can support at his Patreon pinned in the comment below. Now, in the dark, shadowed valley where Michaelstein Abbey used to be, there was once a lonely hunting lodge owned by the Count of Untitled. Now here he lived the greater part of the year in splendid company, for the beauty of his only daughter attracted a great crowd of young noblemen to this location, who all, of course, sought to court her. But no one was able to attract her eyes. Independent as she was, indeed, she rejected all with cold scorn, and proclaimed loudly that she would only belong to the one among the German nobles who was her equal in beauty. Have standards, girl. One day, she was accompanying her father on a hunt in a nearby wood. And was surrounded by her large entourage. But it was then that she saw a proud, noble stag nearby, which headed towards the wildest undergrowth in his flight. Immediately she spurred her palfrey onwards in pursuit, and when the Count witnessed this, he shouted to his daughter, "Stay back, and don't approach the eerie fir thicket." For the evil one was known to dwell there, and bathed his limbs in the wild Giesbach stream. But whoever dares to go into the devil's territory without being protected, of course, by a blessed rosary or some other amulet, will belong to him, with body and soul. But these words did not reach the ears of the Countess, for she had already crossed the borders of that wilderness and boldly raced over stone cracks in her path, and then she reached a swampy region at that location where the waters of the Menschenmühlenthai pond gather now, and thus was unable to continue her pursuit of that grand and noble stag. She threw her hunting spear all the same after her game in vain, but of course the stag had vanished into the shrubs which rose up from the swamp here and there. So, as she turned to seek out her entourage after the unsuccessful hunt, she beheld a strange sight. In a gap that had been artificially hollowed out, the waters of the wild stream poured down abruptly, only to follow their course beneath the ground, and at the edge of the steep cliff there stood a young man of a tall and handsome shape and vigorous experience. He was lying in a deep slumber. A hunting spear lay next to him that indicated he had fallen asleep from the exhaustion of the hunt. The young Countess was strangely aroused by the appearance of such a beautiful sleeper. She could not avert her gaze from him, and considered it to be her most solemn duty to rescue the sleeper from the danger of falling down the precipice. She thus stepped forward, with only noble intentions, of course, and gently pulled him away from that edge. Then the unknown huntsman called out to her and said, "I thank you, beautiful maiden, for my life." And he wrapped his arms around her, warm and strong. And the proud Count's daughter, who had rejected the suits of the most respected nobles, tolerated the embrace of that man, who was wholly unknown to her, and who was certainly beneath her station. Indeed, though, she lost her countenance so much that she confessed next a sudden flowering love. And she challenged him to meet her the next morning in the valley with a horse if their love was mutual. For she would descend from the castle and flee from her father with him. And just as she had spoken those words, the Count approached at the front of his hunting party. Thinking quickly and determinedly, she introduced the huntsman as her savior from a fall down the precipice. A little lie. Naturally, the Count invited him to come to his castle as a guest. However, on the way there he disclosed to his daughter that he had come to a decision and pledged her hand to a noble for her. Thus she would be betrothed to that noble the next day. Well, the Countess was startled about this surprising news, but she still could hope to flee with her newfound lover, and thus escape the unwelcome betrothal ceremony that her father was imposing upon her. With the first rays of the dawn breaking, she already heard the hooves of the horse echoing below. And immediately she heard, unseen from the castle, down towards the valley. The knight was sitting on a black horse and waited for her. However, once she'd swung herself up on the horse, she found a curiously strange expression on his face. Cold, scornful smile played on his lips. Thus she was rather frightened in his embrace this time. But despite this, she nestled herself close to him and spoke. "In your arms, lover, will I get warm? For the morning air wafts so coldly." But he replied with a strange laugh.
"Soon you shall get hot indeed, once we have reached my home."
The Countess became rather disturbed at these words, but her consternation increased further when the knight steered his horse, directly back towards the castle. And once he was beneath the windows, he shouted to the Count with loud words,
"Behold, Count, how your daughter lets herself be abducted by a groom she has chosen for herself. Come down here and try to get her back."
With these words, he turned his horse towards the forest, and when he beheld the Count and mob of armsmen appearing behind him soon after, he goaded them into pursuing him.
"Come on, come on!"
At times he let them approach closely, but he quickly fled from them again with the speed of lightning, and in this manner he raced towards the dark fir-covered ground where the Giesbach vanishes within the steep rock gorge. And in the heat of the chase, the Count galloped into the ill-reputed fir thicket closely behind him.
"Welcome," shouted the abductor at them. "Welcome to my turf and ground. Now you may witness my how I woo my bride."
And with these words, he embraced the trembling woman more wildly and forcefully from before, and tore at her with his claws. And a stream of fire emerged from his mouth, and when he jumped into the crevice with her at the spot where the unfortunate woman had first seen him. While the Count fled in terror, for he could no longer doubt that his daughter was in the power of the Duke of Hell. He tried to gain some consolation by erecting a chapel in Käthelstein Valley. For the salvation of his daughter's soul, perhaps. Soon after, 2 monks from St. Michaelstein, named Hans and Henrik, attempted to hold mass at the gorge of Teufelsbad, or the Devil's Bath itself, at the spot where the evil one had pulled down the Countess. They hoped to rescue her soul from the power of hell. If they were to succeed in this venture, they could hope for rich rewards from the Count. But before they even reached the Devil's Bath, they were turned into 2 rocks, which are still named after them. Now, no one saw the Count's daughter ever again, but the local people tell legend that at midnight, her funeral procession moves through the gloomy fir woods where the Devil's Bath is located. And the Devil's Bath itself is still visible. Only the swamp, which once covered a large area, is gone thanks to the efforts of the monks. It was possible to drain the water into a pond. These waters then drop into the Devil's Bath and then flow for some time within a subterranean channel until it emerges again as a waterfall. Don't know why it ends that way, by the way. All right. And that tale is The Legend of the Devil's Bath near Michaelstein Abbey. Yeah, sort of as I assumed. I don't think we can read the other 2 stories. But if you do want to read Jürgen Hubert's Sunken Castles, Evil Poodles, and you were wondering which ones I was going to read, it was The Devil and the Bride and The Devil Fetches the Bride. But they both kind of establish more typical tropes, which is, somebody gets punished by becoming the Devil's Bride, or he tries to and they fail because of something the church or priests do. Nonetheless, what it is time for is Translator's Notes, which are coming from the same translator of these works. This part of the show is called Translator's Notes, and it's because translators, I read some contemporary translators' works on this show, and they occasionally bless me by jumping into the comments on previous videos and telling me about just details I missed, or things that they would add, or sort of fleshing it out. And because I don't think people go back and read comments on these videos, I read them aloud here. Now you might be wondering, did Rory forget to take the screen off? I leave this up so people know that these are the translator's words and not my own, so I'm not taking credit for their words. These notes come from Jürgen Hubert, and they were on our cat video, which I'm forgetting the name of, but it was a couple of weeks ago about, well, cats. So now on to Jürgen's comments. As usual, some notes. I plan to stay in the town of Andreasberg, now Sankt Andreasberg, during my August vacation. I will ask around whether the town ever had a town hall with 300 windows, but I suspect not, which is a reference to the story. The German counterpart to will-o-wisps is Erlix, which can be translated as errant, mad, or confusion lights. They appear in all sorts of shapes, but were most commonly believed to be poor souls in purgatory, ghosts, in other words. Which is distinct from will-o-wisps, I should say. Grimm's Dictionary explains that Gefell means animal furs, so maybe it started out as a place for fur trappers or traders, or maybe just the place where someone put down their fur bedding, i.e. someone's home. And that is because Rory, said, according to Google, Gefell meant skin, and I was curious if there was a town actually called Skin in Germany. On back to Jürgen's notes. In this case, a historical anecdote of a cat which has killed a lot of people is a very direct translation of the original title of the folktale, at least as reported by the author of the folktale collection, who might have made it up himself. Because I found that a very entertaining title. Quite a few folktales I have encountered in my research were actually published in the regional dialect. I can read the Franconian and Bavarian dialect, but things get much more difficult for others. If it's just a few sentences that the characters speak, I might seek outside assistance. But if the entire tale is in dialect, I generally don't bother with translating translating it because I can't do it alone. And then the final note from Jurgen is, I think all domestic animals are portrayed in ambivalent ways in folklore, to be honest. A cat you might encounter might be friendly, or it might be a supernatural entity that jumps on your back. A dog you encounter might be friendly, or it might be a supernatural entity that jumps on your back. A cow you encounter might be friendly, or it might be a supernatural entity that jumps on your back. Well, you get the idea. That is the end of Jurgen's notes. To that point, I will say, obviously, there's tons of different versions of how animals get represented, but this is building on a comment I made, which is, I feel like cats have a very ambiguous representation. And I guess, fair enough, there are tales of all different versions of things, but like, if I said there's a black dog with red eyes or fire or something like that guarded a treasure, that's a really common application of a dog. And dogs can also be friendly, but you very often will see that representation. If you talked about a fox being kind of coy and clever and eating everything all the time and tricking other things out of stuff, like that's true across Europe. There's a ton of stories of foxes doing that. But cats always seem so amorphous. Like, I never quite know where a story's going with a cat. It could be a witch. It could be the devil. It could be a friendly compatriot. And I never quite know when I'm reading a story where they're going to go with a cat. But I always kind of feel less surprised when they go certain places with a dog. But my experiences are limited. I don't have a PhD in this or anything. All right. And that ends our translator's notes. And that means that ends our discussion of loose, unwomanly women and committing themselves to the devil himself. Just to be clear, you can be as loose and unwomanly as you want. In case anyone is not picking up on the sarcasm. The devil will not get you that way. But entertaining stories. I will say I'm seriously considering on that last story making a version of it, because she presents almost like this Frau Gauden character. And if people have watched me since at least December, they know Frau Gauden. And if you don't, you should absolutely go and listen to the video about her. She is one of my all-time favorite folklore characters. She's a huntress who leads in some versions of the German tellings of the Wild Hunt a pack of dogs through the skies in her, because she preferred to continue hunting than go to heaven. She's a badass is what she is. But Frau Gauden, I get Frau Gauden vibes from this woman. And I obviously, the devil is a very competent wooer. He is handsome. That's fitting to all versions of his lore, and he's very good at persuading people to do things. He generally comes with a handsome face and a soft voice is sort of the description of him. But I feel like she would put up more of a fight. I feel like, devil or not, she's a brute. She knows how to fight. She ran into a head of her entourage with a spear in hand just because she wanted a prize stag. She's not going down easy. I think there's a version of this tale where she just is just way stronger willed than the devil expected. So make that version of the tale, if I don't. And nonetheless, there you go. That's the trope of the Devil's Bride. If anyone's still left out there, thank you so much for joining in and listening to the stories. If you did enjoy it, please consider giving a like. It absolutely helps in the algorithm for tiny little niche projects like this. I'm trying to tell stories that would otherwise, I think, fade to a dusty death on a shelf. But other than that, I really enjoy anybody who comes along and joins the crowd, whether it's live or not, for some tales of loose woman. Anyways. Shayna says these were a lot of fun, and GS says awesome read tonight. Thank you so much, guys, for keeping me company. I'll keep the fire warm for you. Have a good sleep.